Welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook Live and the only place where we answer your questions about politics in Africa. I'm Peter Clote, Shaka Sally and Paul Ndio are on assignment. Today with me is Ndimiaike Mwakaliele, Chief of the Zimbabwe Service of the Voice of America. Hi Ndimi, how are you doing today?
Hi Peter, thank you for having me back. I'm fine. Fine.
Well, you are watching Shaka Extra Time. So Ndimi, Zimbabwe is still in the news.
Yes.
The elections were announced by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. Everybody was interested in who became Zimbabwe's next president. Emmerson Mnangagwa, the president who stood in while Mugabe was pressured to leave office, was declared the winner.
Right.
But a lot of people have been asking whether the presidential election was free, fair, credible and transparent.
The million-dollar question, right? Yes, I think when I was here last week, we were waiting for this news. The elections had been held the day before, and now we were waiting for the announcement, which I think at the time the pressure was on ZEC to release them because they were taking too long, even though they did have this 5-day window. By all accounts, at least from what we were hearing, right up until election day itself, the question of free, fair, credible. Most of the organizations and the observer missions that were watching and following the process, and some of them got there even 3 months ahead, basically say that they seem to have been an atmosphere of freedom and credibility to the polls. Of course, there were some irregularities pointed out in terms of the campaign season, the campaign period, access to the media, the revelation of the polls, not the polls so much, but the voters' roll. There were some discrepancies there, but for the most part, there was some kind of consensus on the fact that come election day, every or most polling stations showed that there was peace, there was calm, and that the elections were conducted in what seemed to be a transparent manner. Fast forward 2 days after that, and of course the Wednesday, eruption of violence and death, 6 people dead. Now the question is the post-election season. That is what is now really under scrutiny, and whether at the end of the day there's this effort to suppress the will of the people somehow. There's a lot of pressure, and as we speak, in terms of trying to verify whether the elections were indeed free, fair, as we speak, the opposition MDC Alliance is getting ready to launch an official application to the court to challenge the outcome of that election, because the opposition contends that they were not free and they were not fair, and that Mr. Chamisa, Nelson Chamisa, won the election.
But do they even have confidence in the ability of the judiciary to administer free and independent decision based on the evidence they have about voter irregularities, or that there were some shenanigans in manipulating the election result? Do they have confidence that the judiciary or the court will rule independently without any political pressure?
Well, for one, that's the only way to really say you effectively challenged the outcome. You have, there is a provision within the Constitution where you have to formally launch this application within 7 days of the announcement of the elections. Well, obviously, there has to be some belief that the judicial system will work in favor of the process. Will it be in favor of the opposition? Of course, that's a million-dollar question. Will it support the outcome and the ruling of, or the decision that was announced by ZEC? That's another question. But in terms of, you know, having proof, we don't know yet what the opposition MDC Alliance has. It says that it's got all the evidence to show that there was some shenanigans happening at various polling stations, and that there was stuffing of ballots, and that there was clearly skewed tampering. So it's really a question of what evidence do they have, what can they show the courts to actually see now if they will make a decision on that, and they have to make a decision within 14 days after receiving that application.
And Ndimi, how are Zimbabweans reacting to the fact that they went to the polls in a peaceful manner? Some election observers were saying it was smooth, and then all of a sudden there was an eruption of violence because they believed some of the polling stations were tampered with, and that the election result might not necessarily be credible. Now, how are they reacting, and were you pleased with the assessment of the international and local poll observers about the elections?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, a lot of people in Zimbabwe now, and a lot of people you talk to, especially analysts maybe who saw the process through, clearly have, you know, changed their position now. Come election day, there was a consensus, like I said, or a near consensus that, oh, this is the Zimbabwe that we were expecting, you know, the kind that can hold free, fair, and credible elections, and that people's will is expressed the way they rightly feel. But now I think with the following the announcement, at least, of first the House of Assembly elections that gave 2/3 of the majority to ZANU-PF, and then the violence that erupted, soldiers being brought out into the streets, and then now this confusion about who actually ordered them out into the streets. President Mnangagwa is calling for an investigation. So there's a lot of ambivalence now. There's a lot of skepticism now. There's a lot of questions now, which I think is not where many people were expecting to be, even though there was also, of course, you know, the history that you have to always remember about Zimbabwean elections, the violence that normally starts showing up around election time. So I want to say that Zimbabweans were expecting something different, but still very, very cognizant of the realities of the past, 2013, 2008 and beyond, where a lot of election-related violence, disappearances, reports of opposition members or supporters being beaten, and then what is also happening now, you have a lot of opposition members who are claiming to be in hiding, that they have unidentified men and women coming up to their doors at odd hours of the day, asking for them, and that they're being tipped to run away, or, you know. So there is this uncertainty, and I think a lot of, maybe a resurgence of fear that many people were hoping was the past, you know, following the incoming of this new dispensation.
But who is in charge at the moment? Because Emerson Mnangagwa is president-elect, not an official president until he's officially installed, probably in the next few days, probably before next week. But some people are also saying, who brought out the military? Because it is the duty of the police, as mandated by the Constitution, for the police to enforce law and order. I heard they were doing it. Unfortunately, somebody called the military. So who did, and where does the buck stop?
I guess that's what the investigation will prove. So I think I just showed you an article that came out today saying how the Zimbabwe Defense Chief Commander was questioning, actually, who made this call. President Mnangagwa is ordering an investigation as we speak. Well, it hasn't kicked in, I guess, after inauguration. And then we have also the foreign affairs minister, Sibusiso Moyo, who is also a former army man, saying that we don't have enough evidence to substantiate that this is as serious or as severe as it's being portrayed. And then, of course, you have Mr. Chiwenga himself, the vice president, who is also the former commander of the armed services, who is also raising, you know, alarm over what is happening. So I think there is a lot of questions, obviously, because this confusion about who ordered what is clearly showing and maybe revealing what many have been alluding to, which is maybe tension within the ruling government as we speak. Of course, you know, the army was very fundamental to what eventually forced President Mugabe out, the former president of Zimbabwe. And there's always been this ongoing inside and not so openly discussed issue about how do they really get along inside? Is Mr. Mnangagwa really that independent? And is the army really allowing the democratic process to work without basically, you know, using heavy-handedness? So I think it's an outstanding question that I really can't say I have too much insight into, but it's clearly a cause for concern.
Talking about confusion in Zimbabwe, I understand some leaders of the MDC alliance are being wanted. Arrest warrants have been issued for them. But do you perchance know who issued those arrest warrants? Because I understand Tendai Biti is particularly being sorted for because he made some pronouncement saying Nelson Chamisa won the election. which sharply goes against what the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has always been saying, that it is the only institution mandated by the Constitution to declare the outcome of any elections in Zimbabwe. So, talking about the confusion now, what is what?
Well, to add madness to more madness, yes, you have this, you know, the floating question about what was violated in this process and how involved was the opposition or its members in that, making either, I don't think it arises to the nature of treason or anything like that, but the fact that, you know, you have, well, including Mr. Nelson Chamisa himself has been declaring that I'm the winner, I'm the winner. So I think the questioning has to do with, you know, obviously saying that you are in violation of the Constitution, which says that only ZEC can make that announcement of who the winners are. And then you have to go based on the outcome of the election, you know, counting. And then if there's any contestation, you have to go to the courts. So the hiding that is going on, I think it also overlaps with the other issues that are going on to do with security, which not so much has to do with, you know, transparency of getting an explanation, because as I'm explaining, there are a lot who are saying they're in hiding because they're being looked for by unidentified people claiming to be members of the state security agents, claiming to be members of the police. And I think what is so, I guess, present in so many people's mind is the disappearance of Itai Dzamara, the journalist who's now been disappearing almost going on 4 years now, where it was in broad daylight, unidentified people to this day, they don't know. So I think there's this real fear that there's maybe an overlapping need to establish what is going on, at the same time also really infuse fear into people. So there's this need to account, I guess, for Mr. Biti and other members of the alliance, but there's also this fear that is it being used as a cloud of some other activity that could maybe see some very prominent members of the party literally, you know, disappeared.
So who can clear the air and reassure the population about peace and stability? Because there's confusion, people are afraid, there's so much uncertainty. Who can come out, or perhaps the president-elect, to reassure the nation that, you know, we will carry this thing through and probably resolve some of these concerns that you might have, and those perpetrators who created the instability could be dealt with according to the law?
So President Mnangagwa has been, I guess you can say, extending this olive branch. He gave a press conference last week where he told the MDC leader, MDC Alliance leader Nelson Chamisa, to join him in trying to bring peace to the nation. And then also there's a lot of pressure now. There's a lot of international pressure. I think there was just reading various articles coming from various places, including the New York Times. He gave an interview to Sky News yesterday where all these questions are clearly now overshadowing the whole, you know, accolades and the congratulatory messages that should be naturally following a victory, which is, how are you going to do this? The country seems to be falling apart. You know, you have soldiers and police out there, you have people running and disappearing or running for their lives. And I think what he's been saying is basically that he's the president for all the people, and that he wants to bring peace and end. Of course, some are saying, okay, if you want to end the uncertainty and the insecurity, call back the army, call back all the soldiers, just, you know, freshen the air so that there is not so much this intimidation or this cloud of intimidation going on, which has not happened as we speak. So there's a lot of pressure on the president, and I think maybe in the next coming few days, especially leading up to the inauguration, if it happens as scheduled, if the court case is not put into effect, clearly there's going to be a need to have to bring the nation together. I think he did rule out in the same interview that I was listening to with Sky News that there's not going to be a unity government, because he doesn't feel that that's what brought peace in the last election, 2008-2013 period, where ZANU-PF and the MDC joined forces for 5 years and had this unity government. Basically saying this time, you know, I have a mandate. I won clearly outright, and I don't see the purpose of a unity government. So I think unless the government really digs into this one and really owns the tension and all the chaos that is happening, unless they really try to extend an arm of peace by showing that there is peace. And I guess the symbol of peace is not so much police and army tankers in the streets, then maybe people will start having that sense of, okay, maybe there is some order in the country.
Some people, before we go on the break, some people are expressing concern that Nelson Chamisa, the main opposition candidate of the MDC alliance, has not been forceful enough to call for peace. And they said, well, they've seen the president-elect saying stuff, but they are yet to see him come out publicly to call on his supporters to remain calm, to resolve some of these concerns they have by seeking the legal process to address their concerns. What is your take?
Well, I've heard him call for peace. I think I've heard him say that he is a man of peace and that they want to unify the country and that they do not want, as the opposition, I guess, to cause any turmoil in the country. And I believe, from what I keep hearing, his contention is that I just want this election to be reflective of the outcome that it should be, which is me in office. So is it, you know, and they contend also that they do not or have not urged people to go out into the streets, that people are just frustrated and angry and they're basically doing it out of their own free will. And then, of course, there are these counter accusations that it's the ruling party that has now infiltrated these movements and making it appear as though the opposition is causing fracas. And then there's the counter argument as well, ZANU-PF saying, no, it's the MDC supporters and people who have now masquerading as the army. So there's, it's a lot of counter accusation, which unfortunately is not really helping to bring too much clarity to the situation. But I do think it might need to have a situation where you have the joint forces coming together and maybe saying, you know, for the sake of peace, okay, we're going to go through this process of declaring or vetting the process, but please, no violence. And yet that was the message leading right up to the elections. Every day you'd hear this call for no violence, no violence. There was even a peace pledge that was signed by all the parties, all the political parties. No violence, no violence. And it's so unfortunate that it seemed to hold up right up until after the election day. And then everything just went out the window. Quite
unfortunate. You are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show only here on Facebook, where we answer your questions and talk about politics in Africa. Shaka and Paul are on assignment, and Indimiake Mwakalele, chief of the Zimbabwe service, is in Shaka's seat. Now let's continue with some questions from our social media audience. And Indimiake, we have a question from a contributor who said, we have a question about Mali again from David Monda, who says, in Mali there's a runoff election on August 12th between President Ibrahim Keita and Mr. Sisi. In the unlikely event Mr. Sisi wins, will the incumbent relinquish power or the military steps in?
Well, you know, it's almost reminiscent of what's going on in Zimbabwe, right? Even though we don't have a runoff. So obviously, the incumbent President Keita has 41.4%, and Mr. Sisi is around 17%, and I believe that the opposition parties, the other 18 or so opposition groupings, are likely to maybe lend their support to him. Now, with the runoffs, it's always that interesting scenario, right? Whether you know, the combined forces of the opposition, where it's clearly a two-man race or a two-woman race or a two-person race, will the outcome be truly reflective of the will of the people? And I think, you know, the runoff gives that opportunity, where I think it's a question now for those who did not vote, who are registered, to really come out and in strong numbers. Hopefully the process will be very, very democratic and transparent, where you can really evaluate whether there is any kind of tampering that is going on with the ballots. But as far as the process itself is concerned, if it can be very transparent and and credible, where people can see that, you know, they're free to go in and vote, I mean, any outcome is likely, because it's not unforeseen that an opposition can beat a sitting president. I mean, it's happened in several countries. It happened in Zambia. It happened in Senegal. So it's a question of really the transparency and maybe sometimes to a large extent the will of the government to be able to say, okay, I lost and I'm going to step down. So I hope to see that happening in Mali.
See, in some African countries, you've seen this pattern repeat itself, where opposition groups are so many, instead of forming an alliance, because their main aim, as some people say, is to get rid of the incumbent or the ruling party. Yet they are so divided, and then it has to go to a runoff before they try to come together, to get rid of it. And then there's always this fear of violence anytime you go to elections, except a few places in West Africa and Southern Africa region where you have a few countries where they go to the polls without any violence, Botswana, South Africa, even Zambia, that used to be very peaceful, an oasis of peace they call themselves. Now they go to elections, and even regular by-elections, not even the presidential election, there's violence. What accounts for such violence?
You know, I think sometimes it's a question of the question about forming a unified front as an opposition is, I think the million-dollar question sometimes is there a unity of purpose and a unity of understanding what everybody wants? Sometimes the common ground is the removal of the sitting president. And there are some parties that don't believe so much that it's about removing that one person, but really enforcing what they feel is the proper democratic principles of the country. We had that in Zimbabwe, where you have 23 candidates. And you speak to every one of them. Of course, the question did come up, why don't you guys unite? Why don't you form this one grouping? And the answer for most of them is, you know, we've got our own vision that we think the country could really benefit from. And when we join forces with the other groupings, we don't share that common vision. And then, unfortunately, Peter, in cases where sometimes the opposition has to come together for the purpose of victory, it disentangles right after, because of the fact that there is no real unity in terms of the common purpose and the common vision and the common need to come together to really say, okay, we're coming together to not only just take out a sitting government, but to really bring in this democratic trend that has been eluding a country for many, many years. So I think the issue is, of course, sometimes people believing, sometimes genuinely, sometimes it's just self-serving purposes that I can bring more than what some other political candidate. Of course, there's this undeniable issue of ego. You know, who doesn't want their name attached to this presidential candidate status where I'm going to be the one? And I think the answer lies in all those. You know, it's a question of if you and I can form a team, as long as we know that at the end of the day I have my strengths, you have your strength, and together we can bring them together. And unfortunately, sometimes that is what is missing in terms of opposition movements and how they can really form a very strong force against an incumbent party or a government.
A contributor asked this interesting question. He said, who is really in control in Zimbabwe? Is it the military using Mnangagwa, or Mnangagwa using the military to stay in power?
Well, that has been an ongoing debate in Zimbabwe, even going back to the time of President Mugabe himself, where there was always this question, is he really the one in power? Or is it the military that is running things? And of course, after the November 2017 military intervention that actually forced President Mugabe out, of course, then somebody would say, well, it was the military that was in charge all this time. Now, of course, Mr. Mugabe at the time, as is Mr. Mnangagwa now, he's the commander-in-chief of the army. How much power do they exert? What can they, you know, do to offset any kind of counter coup attempts, etc.? In the case of Zimbabwe right now, it's difficult because, you know, a lot of the top members of his party are former military men, talking about the vice president, Chiwenga, talking about the foreign affairs minister, Sibusiso Moyo, talking about even the minister of agriculture, who was the former commander of the Air Force. And then even within the party, there are accusations that even within ZEC, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, that there are many former army members. So you know, it's one of those things, unless you're really, really on the inside, which I'm not, it's a difficult question to answer, because clearly on the outside, President Mnangagwa says, I'm in charge. And even when it was under President Mugabe, he would admonish the army, saying, stay out of politics, and then see what happened.
New team, when you see Musaila ask, to what extent are young people prepared for politics in Africa? And let me quickly add that for a continent full of young people, they tend to elect old people as heads of state. What say you?
So you have a situation where, like say in Ethiopia, you have a new, vibrant, young leader. You have a situation in Zimbabwe where there was maybe a potential leader in the making with Nelson Chamisa. And you find that a lot of the youth are very, very active in terms of, you know, participating in the process. Now, my concern, maybe sometimes among the youth, and I did talk to several, not that I talked to the representative of the majority, but some that I spoke with were more fire than action. You have a lot of times where the youth, maybe, even though in Zimbabwe they made up the bulk of the number of registered voters, there could have been more. And then also in terms of turnout, do most of them actually turn out to vote and really push for the candidate that they want? Maybe to your question about picking older candidates, I'm not so sure about that, but I think there is also still that belief that the older population is the wiser generation, has more to offer. But I think that trend is changing now. You have a lot of young people now who are very, very dominant in whatever fields of work or study that they're in. And I think it's starting to trickle down. And when you see examples like just to name the Ethiopian situation with Abiy Ahmed, that wait a minute, I mean, after all, 40 years is allowed within the Constitution to run for president. And then, of course, even when you have the U.S. situation where you have a president who was elected at 44, you think, well, you know what? Give the nation, give the youth a chance. But I think it's also a question now of maybe the youth being more galvanized as well, and not to also take away the fact that they also have their own vision and they also have their own intention. So some people did vote for, some youth did vote for the incumbent President Mnangagwa, and some did vote for the opposition MDC alliance member Nelson Chamisa. So sometimes it's really also sometimes where do the youth see themselves going with the administration that they choose.
Before we leave, Gilbert Sebeyeboa from Tamale, Ghana, and Francis Chansa from Lusaka, Zambia, asked same question: why do we always have troubles with elections in Africa? And Annabelle Roberts from Sierra Leone asked, why is it that after electing our president, they refuse to do exactly what they told us when campaigning?
So I think it's about the role of civil society. I think it's the role of the citizens of a nation and to hold the administration in office accountable. I think, you know, you and I being here in this country, you see that at work a lot of times. How often do you push the agenda? How often do you, make sure that you are always in the forefront of issues that maybe an administration might have reneged on? What was your campaign promise versus what you're doing in office? And how consistent are you in terms of making sure that that accountability is tested either through the ballot or in terms of, just always forming organizations and civic groups that can always be the conscience pricker, where you're asking demanded questions, using the media ourselves as well to make sure that we're always raising the issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you all for joining us on Shaka Extra Time, a show only on Facebook where we answer your questions. Indimiake Mwakaliele, Chief of the Zimbabwe Service, is sitting in for Shaka. Thank you, Indimiake, and thank you all for joining me. I'm Peter Clottey. See you next week. Bye for now.
And he thinks about